All right, we'll get started as folks continue to join. Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Kira Clark-Wolf. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate and other environmental changes, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will be able to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A. We'll end the formal part of this presentation at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to engage in a more informal conversation with our speakers is encouraged to do so. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today, John Bradford, Martin Holdridge, and Daniel Schleifer. All of them are part of the Dryland Ecohydrology team, which is a collaborative research group across the US Geological Survey and Northern Arizona University that conducts applied research to understand the impact of climate change on upland vegetation in dryland ecosystems. John is a research ecologist with the USGS Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and his work focuses on how climate change and altered drought will interact with disturbances to impact dryland vegetation. Martin is an ORISE postdoctoral scientist who studies water-limited ecosystems and is currently focused on the effects of climate change and disturbance such as wildfire and grazing in sagebrush ecosystems across the Western US. And Daniel is a senior research scientist at Northern Arizona University's Center for Adaptable Western Landscapes that develops and applies simulation models focusing on dryland ecohydrology, climate change, and plant ecology to understand responses of dryland ecosystems to a warming climate, disturbances, and land management. The title for today's webinar is Assessing the Future of Sagebrush Ecosystems to Inform Climate Adaptation. Thank you again to all the speakers. And John, please take it away.
Thank you, Imtiaz. Thanks, Kira, and thanks to the North Central CASC for hosting this webinar. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you. We're going to tell you a little bit about some of our work trying to understand the future of sagebrush ecosystems and ideally to inform climate adaptation in this really widespread ecosystem type across drylands of the Western US. Before we start, though, I want to just acknowledge some of the many people that have contributed to our work. I won't go all the names. You can see all the logos in there. We've got lots of collaborators within the USGS, within universities, and perhaps most importantly, we work closely with scientists in various land management agencies to try to develop and design useful, actionable applied work. And along those lines, I do want to acknowledge that our funding comes from the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers, as well as the Ecosystems Mission Area, and also, of course, many of the Department of Interior agencies that we work closely with. As Imtiaz mentioned, we are a collaborative team that we label ourselves the Dryland Ecohydrology team. There's several folks there. You can see all the people. You're just going to hear from a few of us today, myself and Daniel and Martin. This group is collaborative between the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, the Southwest Biological Science Center, as well as Northern Arizona University, and we use the ORISE opportunities as well. Our work is really focused on trying to understand the future of ecological drought in drylands. You hear something about that. Ideally inform long-term planning under climate change. You'll hear some about that. And also thinking about trying to reduce uncertainty about the utility and effectiveness of adaptation strategies. And we'll also talk a little bit about that as well. And our work is really typically quite geographically broad. We use a number of different geospatial techniques and simulation modeling, as you'll hear about as well, to try to get a handle on what the future might hold for these dryland ecosystems in the coming decades. So this gives you a flavor for what we're going to try to talk about today. We'll start with Daniel's going to talk about the future of ecological drought in sagebrush systems, tell you a little bit about the approach that we take to understand that, think about what we've found in terms of potential shifts in soil moisture patterns, and also what that might mean for ecological resistance and resilience. And then Martin's going to pick up and explore some of those implications for plant communities in sagebrush ecosystems, thinking about, again, letting you know kind of the modeling approach we take for that, what we found in terms of some of the potential shifts in plant community types, and what that implies for the future of sagebrush habitat. And then I'll wrap up with some I think emerging thoughts about how we might want to start coping with uncertainty to really support adaptation investments. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Daniel to get started thinking about ecological drought.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I'll start with our approach to soil moisture modeling, and start with a little broader scope here that I think as ecologists, we are all aware about the complex relationships that soils and plants and the atmosphere exhibit. Particularly in drylands, moisture is limited. And so we find tight links between moisture availability and ecosystem composition, structure, and functioning, and the processes that society cares about, such as wildfire, biomass production, and grazing. And this gives us an opportunity to ask questions about ecological drought through the lens of soil moisture and increase our understanding of these ecosystems. Other studies have used elevation, often at local scales along a mountain slope, and or precipitation for very large-scale biogeographic continental scale studies. But we find that in that geographies that we work, these are often not fully capturing the spatial patterns and the dynamic that we see in soil moisture and ecological drought to sufficiently capture what the question that we are asking about. So we identified a few criteria that we believe are important to get right for useful soil moisture simulation models. So the first one is a sufficient temporal resolution, because we want to capture quickly emerging phenomena such as flash droughts, and also the interseasonal exchange of moisture, such as cool season precipitation that is utilized during the warm summer months. Another point is the importance of site-specific soil conditions in these models. And I'll try to illustrate that with this upper right panel, where I plotted the soil moisture release curves for different soil textures, and that illustrates how soil texture has a big influence on what a certain water content is perceived by plants in terms of whether there's moisture that is available to the plants or whether these soils are dry. And obviously, we also know that these thresholds depend on the specific plant species. And so another point is sufficient spatial resolution across the soil profile to resolve seasonal spatial dynamics that emerge. And that's the lower panel that shows a heat map of water potential across soil depth and the season. And maybe you can imagine sort of a seedling starting to grow at the beginning of the spring. And that seedling attempts to extend its rooting system to maintaining contact with moist soils as summer months warm up and dry out surface soil layers. And so our fourth point is the importance of representing vegetation structure and physiology, including below ground rooting profile. And particularly for applications of long-term climate change, CO2 fertilization in vegetation, and plants, and the shift itself in structure and physiology of vegetation and the composition is important to get included here. And so we believe that our tool that we use, Solver2, meets these criteria and can produce useful insights. And so this is a simple diagram that Martin will build on in the next section, and it illustrates how inputs of daily weather variables, site-specific soil properties, and representation of vegetation above and below ground is translated in that simulation model into daily outputs of soil moisture and water balance. And it's these metrics that we are using to calculate ecological drought metrics and other metrics that we can then answer a range of questions. And so in the next few slides, I'd like to present a range of applications where we use Solwet to address questions related to sagebrush interactions with dry seasons and future projections of drought. But so I want to start out with observed historical trends over the last few decades, bringing back a couple figures from the National Climate Assessment Report 5 of increasing annual temperatures that I'm sure all have seen, and also shifts in precipitation regimes, here illustrated by summer precipitation. So we have decreases in the west of summer precipitation, maybe accompanied with a shift towards cool season precipitation. And in other areas, and some of the Great Plains portions, are rather increases in summer precipitation. And so we asked, what do these changes in temperature precipitation mean for soil moisture? And we used a Solwet on several hundreds weather stations that Van Witsang, a postdoc of Joel Biderman, collected, and we looked at changes of soil moisture over the last 40 years. And so these are two figures of different soil layers of these results, and we see that in blue, there have been increases in soil moisture, particularly in the northern Great Plains regions, but widespread decreases in red across a large parts of the west. And these patterns, they match the overall trends that we have seen in temperature and precipitation. And when we compare the shallow and the deep moisture results, we see that there's stronger decreases in shallow soil layers across most of the west, which corresponds to the shifts of precipitation towards a cool season regime. And so with rising temperature, that means there's greater demand by the atmosphere for moisture. And we ask the question, how does temperature change going forward during periods when soils are dry? And this is here plotted on the y-axis. And we found that these temperatures, when the soils are dry, are increasing faster than temperature on average. And that means that the vegetation is exposed to greater stress, which potentially can lead to mortality events. And when we plot that on a map, we find that these difference in these hot, dry temperatures increases even faster towards the northern part of that area, including the northern Great Plains. In that same study, we also mapped different metrics of dryness of different soil layers that we can see here, and we identified robust signals in these changes by looking at agreement among the different climate model runs that went into these maps. And so we found areas of increases in dry soils across the west, but also areas of decreases in dry soils, again, particularly the northern part of the Great Plains. That matches what we have seen over the last few decades. And so when we zoom in a little bit more into what happens within a season for big sagebrush systems, I have here figures of soil water potential in shallow and deep soil layers, and moisture extracted from different this different depth used for transpiration. We see a specific ecological niche emerge. So we have the seasonal dynamics where we have recharge of the soil profile by cool season precipitation. And then as summer warms up, they dry out surface soil layers, but not necessarily as much deeper soil layers. And so there's a shift of water extracted for transpiration towards these deeper soil layers, facilitated by the deeper roots of big sagebrush. And so this is this distinct pattern of utilization of this deep seasonally stored water that characterizes a large portion of the sagebrush region. And so when we project those conditions into a future climate, we see the signal of wetter winters. There's an earlier recharge of the soil in the season, and the summer periods, the summer dry periods, they are longer and also hotter, and this matches the metrics of dry soils that we saw before on the maps. And in terms of water use for transpiration, we find a earlier start of water extracted, earlier a spring green up, an earlier senescence in the season, or a shift towards the shoulder seasons. And so in another project, we worked with addressing the questions about how these sagebrush systems are responding to changes in resistance and resilience that has been spearheaded with the R&R indicators by Gene Chambers over the last 10-15 years. And so these R&R indicators stand for resistance of sagebrush systems to cheatgrass invasion and resilience to recover from stress, particularly fire. So they have traditionally been mapped as static information in a few categories. We see here in red the low R&R categories, and then medium low, medium and medium high, and high and medium high in the blues. And we worked with Gene Chambers and her team to develop predictive models of these R&R indicators that use a set of ecologically relevant metrics that capture different aspects of drought and are responsive to climate change. And this allowed us to develop projections of these R&R indicators for the future that we mapped here and identified areas where we see a change in the category of these R&R indicators. And so these results suggest that most of the area that was historically low, the red areas in the previous maps, they remained low, that we see here in the dark gray areas on this map. It's also partly the case because the framework didn't allow to go below what was historically low. Other categories either decreased, these are shown here in purple, or they remained the same. These are the other gray areas on this map. It was the moderate R&R categories that had the most widespread decrease, and many of those areas we found in Wyoming and the Montana areas. And so our results suggest that climate change is amplifying the restoration challenge in many of those areas. So we released the spatial layers in a science-based data release, and Martin developed a web app where you can go and interactively explore these different layers at for different projections, and also compare them between two different variables. And I invite you to follow these links and explore these layers for yourself. There's one last project that I would like to briefly mention. It's a new project that we're starting up that works on projections of long-term soil moisture and ecological drought metrics. This is a CASC-funded project where we tackle the challenge of expanding our study area from the drylands in the western US to all of the lower 48 states, including humid climate regimes. And we are developing simulation runs to produce data sets that include daily soil moisture for multiple soil depths and a range of ecological drought metrics. And we plan to disseminate these data via the Climate Toolbox. So one aspect that we're currently working on is identifying which ecological drought metrics to include in these data. And we aim to inform long-term management decisions. And so we believe that they should be sensitive to climate change. And some of those metrics should address overall conditions in these systems. Others quantify seasonal variability and seasonal timing, and of course cover a range of aspects of ecological drought. And so I reach out to you and invite you to contact me if you can share what information related to future ecological drought would be useful for your work coming out of this project. And with that, I hand it to Martin for the next section.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so Daniel talked about kind of these soil moisture implications, and now I'm going to talk about what that means for plants specifically. I'm going to mention kind of our overall modeling approach, focusing on plant community changes in response to climate change. Talk about some of what that means for some of the key plant functional types, as well as some broader implications for kind of sagebrush habitat quality. So Daniel described this soil moisture modeling approach that we used that is, among other things, estimates the amount of water that's available for plants. And we're then coupling this soil moisture model with a plant community model. And that's the results that I'm going to be showing are tied to this plant community model. So roughly speaking, what it's doing is it's basing the amount of plant growth that can occur on the amount of soil moisture that's available, depending on the time of year and the depths. So more water available at the right times means you get more plant growth of these key functional types. We're then also simulating some forms of disturbance. So the frequency of wildfire is tied to the amount of biomass as well as climate. And we're simulating removal of biomass to represent livestock grazing as well. So first here, I'm going to show some results focusing on sagebrush, obviously a key plant in these ecosystems. And this map is showing projected changes in potential sagebrush growth under climate change. And you can see both increases and decreases across the biome based on the changes in climate. And this is just one perspective, but kind of our work and the work of others more broadly suggests that across most of the biome, big sagebrush is still likely to be climatically viable in the future, but we do still have potential declines in some areas due to climate change. Another key group in these systems are perennial grasses, and we're here thinking about two main groups of perennial grasses. The one are the C3 or cool season grasses, which are kind of the most dominant across most of the biome. And so they're key for both wildlife and for livestock grazing. And here this figure is showing results suggesting declines in these cool season grasses under climate change. The warm season grasses here shown on the right-hand side are mostly showing increases under future climate conditions, with the caveat being that they're very uncommon across much of the biome, especially in the West. So this is also sort of assuming that they're able to establish in some of these places where they may not exist, or they're only at very low levels. And so kind of overall, what results are from our work and other work as well is suggesting is that future temperatures are in general more consistent with the conditions that warm season grasses inhabit versus cool season grasses, suggesting cool season grasses may decline and warm season grasses might increase. But this isn't kind of an important change because of the difference in their phenology. So this would be a shift in when the biomass is available for wildlife and livestock. So this would be an impactful change. Also of great importance in these ecosystems is invasion by annual grasses, which is a very large threat throughout most of the biome. And here, this map is showing changes in cheatgrass biomass. So in the light blues are some areas where, for example, you might see a 30 gram per meter squared increase in cheatgrass, which may not sound a lot, but you know, in our modeling, that may result in, for example, a 25% increase in the frequency of wildfire in some of these areas. And so broadly, kind of our perspective is that climate change is potentially amplifying some of these threats. So the historical trend of cheatgrass invasion is likely to continue. And then another problem is that wildfire may increase as a result of climate change in some areas, which can then further exacerbate this problem of this cycle between cheatgrass and fire. Next, I want to talk about kind of what these changes in these individual groups means more broadly for overall kind of ecological integrity of these ecosystems. And that's tying into work by coming out of the Sagebrush conservation design. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about what this kind of means under climate change. And Jeff Bedrosian gave a talk about the Sagebrush conservation design in the seminar series last month. And he gave kind of a great overview of the history of this work and a lot of the science that's come out of it. So I'm going to be kind of brief on the background, but I recommend that you check that out for more information about the Sagebrush conservation design, which broadly hoped to identify some of the key areas where they have good sagebrush ecological integrity, as well as some of the key threats to these ecosystems. So coming out of this project was a index that was trying to get kind of an overall score of ecological integrity. And it was positively related to the amount of sagebrush on the landscape and negatively related, positively related to the amount of sagebrush and perennial grasses, and then negatively to the amount of annual grasses, conifers, and human modification on the landscape. And this index was then further kind of categorized into three main groupings, and those are shown on this map here on the left. So in dark blue are places that were defined as core sagebrush areas. So these are intact sagebrush ecosystems. They don't have a lot of threats, and I've got adequate cover of both sagebrush and perennials. And then in light blue are growth opportunity areas. So those are places where maybe there's some more threats, some invasion of annual grasses, or maybe less perennial cover, something like that. And then in the tan color or other rangeland areas, so those are places that may have higher levels of invasion or conifer encroachment, or maybe lower levels of sagebrush or perennial grasses. So a lot of these are more degraded sites, but they don't necessarily need to be. They could be an intact ecosystem that's just not, you know, a sagebrush dominated type ecosystem. So our work that I'm going to be describing here focused on trying to understand what this sagebrush ecological integrity metric might look like in the future, taking into account changes in some of these key functional groups. So what we did, for example, is estimate the amount of change in the amount of sagebrush. So if we, for example, simulated in a given location a 10% reduction in sagebrush, we'd then update the calculation of sagebrush ecological integrity. So we'd take the remotely sensed cover estimate and modify it to get a future estimate. And we did the same thing for perennial grasses as well as annual grasses. Important caveat here is that we assume that conifers and human modification stayed at their current levels. And the reason we did that is just we currently don't have estimates of those two components and how they might change in the future. And so this map here is now changing, showing how those key categories of sagebrush ecological integrity might change in the future. So this matrix here, color matrix on the bottom, is showing on the diagonal places where we're projecting no change in the category. And then in the top right, so the reds are showing declines. So for example, if we look at the places in dark blue, those are places that are core now, so they're intact, not a lot of threats. or not a lot of invasions, for example, by annual grasses, and they've got good sagebrush cover, good perennial grass cover. And we're projecting that those still will be climatically suitable to be core in the future. And that's kind of in contrast to some, say, the light red area, where that's a core now, but we're projecting it to decline and become a growth opportunity area in the future. We also wanted to think about kind of the uncertainty among climate projections and incorporated that into our results. So I'm just showing one climate scenario here, one emission scenario and time period. But here we were then trying to think about how variable our results are across different global climate models. So we considered something to have kind of a robust agreement or strong trend if we had agreement of at least 90% of our different climate models that we used. So in this dark blue are places that are core now, and we've got 90% of the global climate model results agreeing that it'll still be climatically suitable to still be core in the future. So kind of a more robust trend in those places. And so kind of to summarize some of the main findings here, roughly 2/3 of the places that are currently core we're projecting to still remain climatically suitable to be core in the future. And then places where we're projecting losses of core, those losses are mostly or almost entirely due to less sagebrush or more annuals in the future. And we did see quite a bit of variability among the different climate futures that we considered. But kind of the overall trends we saw were similar. It's more the magnitude of declines varied across these different climate futures. And if you're interested in viewing kind of some of these layers that I didn't show today and some of the other variables we looked at, as well as some various model assumptions we made, we can put this link in the chat for a web viewer to explore this data more and kind of maybe zoom into your area of interest. Now I want to just describe kind of a project that we're now starting, which is trying to combine this information from the sagebrush conservation design as well as from the resistance and resilience data that Daniel described. So the goal here is to try to see if there's additional information that you can glean by looking at both of these different data sets together. And this figure here is meant to sort of provide an example of the climate space, or not the climate space, the potential combinations of these two variables that can then result in maybe different decisions in the kind of context of maybe resisting ecological change or accepting or directing ecological change. So if we look at the top left corner here, those are places that are currently core sagebrush areas, and we're projecting them to be core in the future, but they also have high ecological integrity. So these are places that have a lot of potential, and resisting ecological change is maybe a likely decision. And then in the top right are places that are a little more complicated. They're places where they're projected to be other rangeland areas, lower ecological integrity, but have high resistance or resilience. So, there might be greater opportunity to restore them. And then the bottom right are places that are potentially degraded and have low resistance and resilience. So the potential for restoration success is pretty low. These are already systems that are under most conditions already challenging to restore. So they're accepting or directing ecological change might be necessary. And then the bottom left corner is also a little bit more complicated. These are places where they're projected to be core, but have low resistance or resilience. So these are places that are in good shape, but if we lose them, they would be hard to get back. So they may prioritize, protecting something like that from disturbance. So to make that a little more concrete, if we focus here on kind of just southwestern Wyoming, there's a very large area of stable core, so projected to still be core in the future. But the resistance or the resilience is projected to be low in the future. So this is one of the largest core areas in the whole biome, but in the future under hotter, drier conditions, it'll be harder to restore some of those habitats, if they're lost to disturbance. I also wanted to touch on another project that we're working on, focusing on grazing. So one component is focusing on grazing sustainability in using similar modeling framework that I've described for our other work. And so here we're trying to understand how sustainable is grazing under future climate conditions, and then also can we modify grazing intensity to help mitigate some of the climate effects on both vegetation as well as the climate effects on changes and increases in the amount of wildfire. And in a related project that our colleague Cal Palmquist is leading, thinking about targeted grazing specifically of cheatgrass. So one component is pulling together results from existing field experiments on targeted grazing. And then the other component is then using that information along with kind of this similar simulation modeling to try to understand, can we target cheatgrass with grazing to then bring down the cheatgrass fire cycle under future climate conditions. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to John for the last section.
Thanks, Martin. So you've heard from Daniel a little bit about our perspectives on ecological drought, and Martin for a little bit about what that means or might mean for implications for the plant communities. I'm just going to take a couple minutes and share some of I guess some emerging perspectives about what I see as this need to really embrace the challenge of coping with uncertainty. I mean, thinking about climate change and long-term impacts and long-term adaptation strategies is really all about dealing with uncertainty. And I think it's becoming more and more relevant and important to really identify the types of uncertainty we're considering and to actually try to incorporate them, because I think a lot of what we need going forward is a framework that allows us to sort of assess the holistic impacts of climate adaptation investments. And this is, honestly motivated by the sort of social and political environment that we find ourselves in these days, where there's a lot of I think, newly critical perspectives being brought to the investments that we're making in the public sector and in adaptation in general. So maybe we can approach sort of helping people understand the value of investing in climate adaptation by trying to be comprehensive in our assessment of what the future looks like if we invest in adaptation versus if we don't invest in adaptation. And perhaps it's reasonable to think that in order to do that, we need to struggle with at least, but maybe one could categorize uncertainty into three broad categories: climate uncertainty we need to wrestle with, ecological uncertainty, and management effectiveness uncertainty. So all I'm going to do is sort of walk through these, give you a little bit more perspective about what we mean by those different types of uncertainty and how we've, I think, just started to scratch the surface of really considering them. We haven't done this comprehensively, but there are some small examples in the work that Martin described for the sagebrush conservation design and the future of the SCD that provide, I think, some perspectives on how one might approach this in a more complete way. So starting with climate uncertainty, this is uncertainty in how the climate is going to respond to a given amount of forcing, emission scenarios, that kind of thing. This is partially captured by comparing the different scenarios, the RCPs, the SSPs you've heard about with climate projections, and the different climate models within them. I think it's also safe to say this is relatively well recognized, and it's often relatively well addressed. You've seen this, plots like this one on the right. This shows average temperature, annual temperature for the historical period, and then the future projections for the sagebrush biome. This comes directly out of the data that Martin was working with for that study. You can see the different RCPs increasing in the future, and then the spread among climate models within the RCPs has the shaded area. So this is all pretty familiar. The only thing new here for everyone is just this data is directly related to the sagebrush biome. The second type of uncertainty we could call ecological uncertainty. This is uncertainty in how the ecosystem is likely to respond to those changes in climate. I think it's often not well estimated, or at least not nearly well as estimated as the uncertainty in climate itself. So, we considered uncertainty from, some ecological processes, but not all. For example, one that we did look at in that study was the potential impact of carbon dioxide fertilization and how that might impact the responses of plants to climate change. And we found that including CO2 fertilization effects, might moderate perhaps 15% of the losses of core habitat areas. So it's not a huge effect, but it is some effect, and it gives you some idea of how one might struggle with this ecological uncertainty. And of course, again, CO2 fertilization is just one example that I'm using to sort of illustrate the point of the need, I think, to consider this type of uncertainty. Ultimately, I think what we really need is multiple ecological models. I mean, one can explore these uncertainties within a model, but ideally we'd have multiple ecological models that provide a perspective on the uncertainty, similar to the way that the climate modeling community has multiple climate models, and they bring them together in the coupled model intercomparison experiments, the CMIP experiments. So the third type of uncertainty is what I'm calling management effectiveness uncertainty. This is uncertainty about how the ecosystem services that we actually value are likely to respond to particular management actions. I think it's fair to say that, especially in the long-term climate adaptation context, this is rarely considered. In sagebrush ecosystems, these management actions might be something like fire suppression, post-fire restoration, maybe invasive plant treatments, possibly assisted migration. And so, thinking about this example of assisted migration or assisted relocation, whatever term you want to use, we explored that a little bit. Martin mentioned in his section that there's several lines of evidence that the cool season C3 grasses might be decreasing. Those are the most abundant in the region, while the C4 warm season grasses might be increasing. Those are in many places of the region not nearly as abundant. So the question is, are they going to be able to increase fast enough to make up for the loss of the cool season grasses? And so we were able to ask that question and ask the question, what would happen if we, through management actions, were to facilitate that increase through assisted migration? And for the purposes of this simulation, we imagined we could do it perfectly. And what we found is that if you allow the C4 grasses to increase as fast as they need to take advantage of the new climate conditions, the core habitat loss is perhaps 9% less. And this 9% is relatively independent of the actual climate scenario you look at. So it's 9% less under the lower emissions, lower change RCP 4.5, also 9% less under the higher emissions. So this provides some perspective on how much core habitat might be able to be preserved through a specific widespread climate adaptation intervention. So ideally, I think we'd use studies like this, perspectives like this is again just one example, and integrate those into some sort of cost-benefit analysis in which we can say, okay, it might cost us X million dollars to make this intervention, to pursue this climate adaptation strategy, but we might be able to have an impact on the ecosystems and their services that is worth more than that, presumably, and thus make the sort of coherent, comprehensive case for long-term, large-scale climate adaptation investments by comparing the cost of C4 grass assisted migration with the costs or the benefits of protecting the core habitat. So I think it's safe to say that however we categorize these types of uncertainty, there's a growing need to recognize that they're there and to recognize that I think it's incumbent on us to try to understand the implications of those uncertainty and try to provide some perspective on them so that we can provide clear-eyed perspectives and I think assessments of the value of what are pretty sizable climate adaptation investments that are going to be needed, I think, to help these systems sustain their services in the future. All right, I'm just going to wrap up with a few take-home messages and hit some of the high points that we addressed today. First, Daniel's slide suggested that the drought impacts in the north central region include that this region may be relatively well positioned relative to other parts of the sagebrush region, relatively well positioned to maintain those historical seasonal soil moisture patterns. On average, there may be potential for some wetter soils in the north central region, although it's worth noting that this area is also expected to experience elevated stress from large temperature increases during the dry soil periods, as Daniel suggested. Thinking about what that means for plant community impacts, the future changes for the big sagebrush biome plant communities, they vary quite a bit spatially, and they are relatively modest in most of the north central region, again, compared to some other parts of the region. We do expect perennial grasses that may shift from cool season to more warm season grasses, and invasive annuals may also increase in this region that has been relatively unimpacted, at least by cheatgrass, in the past several decades. In terms of other impacts on the sagebrush ecosystem, the north central region supports some of the most climate resilient and high quality sagebrush habitat. That's what really came out of the sagebrush conservation design. thinking about the future, we know that rising temperatures are expected to decrease resistance and resilience over most of this north central region, which suggests that there's going to be some, I think, complicated challenges, as Martin laid out, between an area that may have decreasing R&R, but also still be climatically viable to support high quality habitat. How do we navigate that in a sensitive and appropriate way? I think it'll be interesting. Lastly, I think considering uncertainty in climate, ecology, and management effectiveness may help us build the case for sustained broad-scale adaptation investments. And before I end, I just want to highlight that we have a science synthesis that's been developed with us and a much larger team that's assessing climate change impacts on big sagebrush vegetation. It's being published by the USGS. It's taken quite a while to go through that process, but there's going to be a lot of the information that we talked about here, as well as a much more comprehensive literature review and a number of maps and information will be available in this. I'm hoping it comes out quite soon. I think we're about done with that review process. If you're interested, let me know. I'm happy to share the draft with you and you can get the insights from it. And with that, we're happy to take questions. And I did see, maybe before we open it for questions, I think Angela in the chat said something about publications. And we do have a slide after here that has most, probably not all, but most of the publications that we mentioned in there. And this will be in the slides if you want to peruse through that. Of course, if you have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. We're happy to connect individually. All right, with that, I think we'll open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John, Daniel, Martin. There's a lot of information, a lot of great information. Really appreciate your time and putting it all together and sharing it with us. Yeah, so I did have that question from Angela on my thing, but thanks for making sure that that's there. And I maybe it's also on your ecohydrology webpage. They can get to some of that papers through projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so folks at this point can feel free to unmute themselves, share your video. We have about 30 minutes for question and answers. So please go ahead. Megan, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I had a question for Martin. I was trying to think a little bit more about your plant community model. And I was curious if ontogenetic differences in rooting depth are or could be incorporated into the model you are using?
Yeah, that's a good question. They currently are not. And I think that is an important variable because, as Daniel showed, with those seasonal changes in the depth of soil moisture under the different scenarios. But currently, we're just taking it as one kind of generic rooting depth for all of the sagebrush. And we would be able to if we were to try to simulate, say, a couple different groups of sagebrush, that would be possible, subspecies, something like that. But currently we have not tried to address that. One thing that's really hard is just rooting depth information is hard to come by. And so that's kind of there's tracer experiments going on right now that I think are helping that. But I think one of the things is just very challenging. So that's an important source of uncertainty too, I think. It's a challenging thing to get at.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking specifically, it could be, if you had sort of like a seedling and adult stage class even, it could have some pretty interesting implications for how much you think species or populations kind of just hang out currently in core versus expand into those different regions, which could be super interesting just in the overall holistic framework you had at the end. So I thought that was really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point.
Other questions? Yeah,
Mind if I jump in with one?
go for it.
Yeah. Thank you, John, Daniel, and Martin. Always learn a lot when I hear you guys present on just such an impressive breadth of work. So thanks for running us through that, and especially landing on those different sources of uncertainty. That management, to me, wrapped up a lot of human land use decisions, right? Ways that we use water on the landscape. And I think there's been some bodies of research looking at, ways that producers and others are adapting to climate change in real time to use water in different ways. So kind of looking back and looking forward, looking back, how much are human land uses tied in with some of these soil moisture and ecological processes that you're modeling? But then also, how much can humans put their finger on the scale? So we've identified a place that, it's supposed to get hotter and drier, or its R&R is decreasing, but it's good. What do we do in this place that's high value but at risk? Do we have some hope in some ways that we can resist that with land use practices?
That's a good question, Jeff. I think most of our simulations, especially when we do them sort of geographically broadly like this, try to approximate the sort of potential vegetation, and of course, then the vegetation has dynamics when it's burned in the type of simulations that Martin did. I think that there is a lot more. I hear more and more conversations around sort of water, being creative with water management, building sort of in-stream dams to try for ephemeral drainages to try to capture some of that moisture before it's lost. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, especially for enhancing the mesic resources within these landscapes that are really important for wildlife dynamics. I think it's going to be harder to try to make an impact with interventions like those over a much broader area when you get out to the uplands and look across, many square kilometers. It's going to be tricky. However, there may be opportunities to provide additional water, or maybe there's some other creative strategies for basically helping plants through that critical establishment phase when they trying to go from a seed or a seedling to an established plant with deeper roots that accesses the deeper moisture. I think that's a real demographic bottleneck. There's been a lot of work showing that as a real challenge in these dryland systems, especially as you get further west, but also in the north central region. And so there may be strategies for targeting water additions, or maybe addition of water holding gels and those kind of things. I'm not getting the right words at the moment, that can help an individual seedling stay alive long enough to develop its root system. I think there's some creative opportunities there. But I don't know, maybe I'll stop there and see if Martin or Daniel have other thoughts about it. It's a good question.
Perhaps we can move to the next question I see in the chat. Thanks for that, Jeff. So the question from John Hughes, would assisted migration of C4 grasses potentially entail active seeding efforts of species that are relatively uncommon in the sagebrush habitat at present? Thinking of mixed grass prairie species such as side oats, grama, and little bluestem that might be analogous to native CT grasses in terms of structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think in places it might. In looking at the BLM AIM data, there are a lot of areas where C4 grasses are very rare, and there's also a lot of areas where there's not about a lot. There's some areas where they don't sort of show up at all in the plant community. So I think there's going to be some efforts to just accelerate or enhance the abundance of those C4 grasses, perhaps using seeds for the species that are already in that location. That might be, so it's maybe assisted relocation or assisted migration isn't even the right term for that particular implementation, because it's really try to insisted increase. And I'm thinking specifically about all the seeding efforts that BLM and other agencies already do in terms of post-wildfire restoration, energy development, reclamation, all those kind of efforts. I think trying to include a larger proportion of C4 grasses to allow them to have the opportunity increase when that opportunity comes along might be at least a first step. In terms of introducing whole new species, there's still, I think, a pretty strong debate about that, and there's a lot of debates about how do we balance the reality of changing climate conditions with the other reality that local adaptation matters in terms of a seed source and a species and a population really being viable in the long term. And I don't pretend to have answers for that, but it's something that I think I'm hearing more and more sort of conversations struggling with that dichotomy. We recognize the value of local adaptation in terms of both species and genotypes and populations, But we have to balance that with the fact that conditions are changing. So we need to know what those species are locally adapted to. Is it extreme conditions? Is it drought during the summer? Or is it low temperature during the winter? And then use that information to try to inform the species or genotypes that we bring in. I think that probably what we would ideally be doing is a set of sort of adaptive management experiments where when we do a large seeding, we structure it in a way that we can include some new populations, maybe more C4 species, maybe new C4 species, and see how those go through monitoring. That's probably the only way we're going to get the kind of information we really need. I don't foresee the kind of societal investments in massive research infrastructure to answer these questions. So I think we really need to try to work within the land management practices that are already happening and try to really embrace the true adaptive management concepts that have been around a long time, but are often not as widely utilized as they could be. I don't know if that helps or not. Feel free to ask if I didn't really answer the question.
Follow up to that. Any other question? So John, a quick follow-up to that is, yeah, I mean, you talked about the climate smart seed mixing and experimenting with it. I mean, given the uncertainty in climate and ecology at different scales, yeah, I mean, what would that climate smart seed mix could look like? And should we just bring new C4 species, but also think about other C3 species? And I mean, should it be just between C4 and C3 type thinking, or it could be more nuanced?
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, the C4, C3 difference is a really broad one. And it's one I think that we've focused on because we're able to parameterize the differences between those two broad plant functional types in our model and see the effects in the future of terms of decreasing suitability for the cool season and increasing for the warm season. But I think you're absolutely right. It's not nearly as simple as just substituting in C4 for C3. And I've been involved in some conversations with the native plant materials programs that BLM has stood up at the different ecoregions. And the researchers and scientists and practitioners in that community have very nuanced perspectives on the value of local adaptation. And so and they really think about it in terms of different seed sources and where different seed sources are likely to be appropriate now and how those conditions are likely to shift in the future. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to try to, again, identify what are the key environmental or climate conditions that a given population is locally adapted to, and how is the distribution of those conditions likely to shift in the future. It's probably not that these species are probably not very often locally adapted to long-term mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. It's probably some measure of extremes, but that's me speculating. So take that for what it's worth, which isn't much. Anyway, I think it's going to be a lot more tricky than just more C4. Although I think that we could start some, as I said, sort of straightforward adaptive management experiments when we're doing big seedings anyway to restore after a wildfire. Let's start embedding some experiments in that. And there's already some of that going on now, but I think we can do more and more of it all the time.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think we are on top of the hour. That's all the time we have for the formal part of the presentation. Just want to thank our speakers again, John, Martin, and Daniel. And we will now shift into the informal session. If anybody would like to be part of that, you're more than welcome. We may stay around for another 15-20 minutes, and you can ask questions and have discussions more informally. So I'll stop the recording at this point.